It began with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that hums with tension, the breath held before the sky tears open. In the early months of 1943, over the Mediterranean Sea, a formation of German fighters cut through thin morning haze. Below them, sunlight bled across the horizon, glinting off waves and aluminum. Then out of the clouds came a shape no one recognized. It moved differently, sleek, fast, deadly. Two long booms stretched behind a central pod. A predator's silhouette. The German pilots had never seen anything like it. One of them, a veteran of dozens of dogfights, radioed in, "What is that thing?" His commander's answer came, confident and dismissive, "An American experiment. Too heavy to turn, too fragile to fight." The aircraft they saw that day was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, one of the most advanced fighters of the war. But in that moment, the men of the Luftwaffe were not afraid, because their intelligence told them they didn't need to be. The confidence came from Berlin. Somewhere in the shadowed hallways of the Reich Air Ministry, a single report had been accepted as fact. It came from one of the Abwehr's most trusted sources in the West, a spy whose dispatches had guided strategy for years. His code name was Alaric. To the men of German intelligence, he was a legend. A man who could penetrate Allied industries, who spoke with engineers, who sent back blueprints and performance figures weeks before the enemy deployed new machines. When Alaric's report on the P-38 arrived, it was treated as gospel. The Lightning, he wrote, was a failure. It suffered from catastrophic engine failures at altitude. Its pilots struggled to manage twin engines. Its airframe shook violently in dives. The Americans, Alaric claimed, have built a beast too heavy to hunt. That line made its way into Luftwaffe briefings. It was repeated, word for word, to squadrons preparing to meet the new fighter. They believed it. And why wouldn't they? It confirmed everything they already thought they knew. In that belief lay the beginning of a quiet disaster. By 1943, the Luftwaffe still carried the ghost of invincibility. Its pilots were among the best trained in the world, its aircraft were considered masterpieces of engineering, and its command believed the Americans were amateurs, wealthy, loud, technically advanced, but lacking the art of war. The Battle of Britain had been a wound, but one wrapped in excuses: weather, fuel, distance. Now, over the deserts of North Africa and the sea between Sicily and Tunisia, German pilots would fight again, against the Americans this time. They expected another easy hunt. But the P-38 was not what they thought. It was faster than the Messerschmitt at high altitude, it could climb higher, and it could take punishment that would send a single-engine plane spiraling down in flames. In the first weeks of combat, the results were shocking. Allied pilots flying the P-38s, young men barely out of training, shot down veteran Luftwaffe aces. 4-to-1 kill ratios. Reports poured in, but Berlin dismissed them. Isolated incidents, the intelligence officers wrote. Pilot error. Bad weather. The Lightning is still an unreliable design. No one questioned Alaric's data. His reputation shielded him. His lies, if they were lies at all, were buried under the weight of bureaucracy and ego. In truth, no one ever proved that Alaric meant to deceive. Perhaps he had been fed disinformation by the Allies. Perhaps he simply exaggerated what he heard to stay valuable in a system that rewarded confidence over caution. The Abwehr was fracturing by then. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, its head, was under pressure from Himmler's SS. Competing agencies spied on one another. Reports were tailored not for truth but for survival. Within that chaos, a single incorrect paragraph could become strategy. While Berlin debated, the Americans refined. Lockheed engineers in California fixed the Lightning's early problems: its dive instability, its cooling system, its handling quirks. By 1943, the P-38 was lethal. Its turbo-supercharged engines gave it unmatched range and altitude. Its concentrated firepower, 4 machine guns and a 20mm cannon in the nose, meant it didn't need deflection shooting. Wherever the pilot pointed, destruction followed. The Germans, still trusting Alaric's words, kept underestimating it. They attacked from below, assuming the P-38 couldn't climb. They tried to outturn it at low speeds, unaware that its counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque. The skies became a graveyard of confidence. In debriefings, survivors reported shock. It climbed like a rocket. It should not have been possible. But even as those testimonies reached command, Berlin refused to believe. It's one of the great ironies of the war, that a nation obsessed with intelligence was undone by its own. By the summer of 1943, the lightning was everywhere, scouting, intercepting, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory. It shot down the most feared pilots of the Luftwaffe, including General Lieutenant Wilhelm Hachfeld over Italy. Each loss should have been a warning. Instead, it was rationalized away. "He must have been caught by surprise," an intelligence officer noted coldly. "The Lightning cannot outperform the 109. The lie persisted because it was comfortable. Inside the Abwehr, not everyone was blind. A handful of analysts began to notice discrepancies. Intercepts from Allied radio, pilot diaries, after-action reports, all pointed to a reality that contradicted Alaric's intelligence. One officer, Oberstleutnant Hans Petersen, wrote a classified memo titled "On the Question of American Twin-Engine Fighter Performance." In it, he warned, "If the data we have received is false, we are sending our pilots to their deaths." His report was buried. "Defeatist thinking," the margin note said. "Destroy after reading." That was the culture of fear that defined the Nazi intelligence machine by 1943. It wasn't that truth was unavailable, it was that no one wanted to hear it. The regime valued optimism over accuracy, faith over fact. And Alaric, whether by design or accident, gave them exactly what they wanted. To understand how this could happen, we must look at the deeper illness within the system. The Abwehr was collapsing under political pressure. The SSSD was taking control of foreign intelligence. Canaris, once respected, was now suspected of disloyalty. Analysts were replaced by ideologues. Reports were rewritten to fit Hitler's expectations. "The Führer does not wish to hear negative assessments," one memo from the High Command stated. And so men who might have spoken truth fell silent. Meanwhile, in Allied briefings, the story was reversed. American pilots were told the Germans underestimated them. "They think we're clumsy," one commander said. "Let's prove them wrong." The Lightning became a weapon not just of metal but of perception. It fed on the enemy's pride. Every victory reinforced the illusion that the Americans had been weak, until suddenly they weren't. The P-38's impact was far greater than its kill counts. It allowed the Allies to project power deep into Axis territory months before other fighters could. It escorted bombers to Rome, Naples, and later, southern France. It killed high-ranking officers, including Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in the Pacific. It was fast, silent, and merciless. To the Germans, it became a ghost, an aircraft that intelligence said could not exist as it did, and yet was there, every day taking more lives. The truth finally reached Berlin through the back door. Captured Allied documents, field reports, and interrogation of downed American pilots revealed performance figures that matched what German analysts had feared. Someone quietly began to ask, where did the bad data come from? Tracing it back led to the Abwehr's western section, and to Alaric. By late 1944, his name was no longer spoken in the corridors with pride, but with suspicion. Some believed he had been a double agent. Others said he was simply incompetent. Canaris, who might have known, was already under arrest, later executed for his role in the July 20th plot. The organization that once guarded truth had eaten itself alive. But by then it didn't matter. The damage was irreversible. Thousands of Luftwaffe pilots had died trusting information that was never real. The myth of German air superiority was collapsing. The P-38 Lightning, once mocked as a mechanical mistake, now ruled the skies over Italy and France. In every war, victory is often less about firepower and more about belief. Belief in what you think the enemy can or cannot do. In that sense, the Germans lost not to the Lightning but to their own certainty. And yet, for all the tragedy that followed, the story of Alaric and the P-38 was not simply about a spy or a machine. It was about the architecture of arrogance, the quiet assumption shared by so many in Berlin that Germany could not be wrong. The Luftwaffe's confidence had been forged in the early blitzkriegs, when everything they built seemed unstoppable. Pilots like Galland and Marseille had written their legends in the skies of France and North Africa, and those legends had become dogma. But the world that existed in 1943 was not the one they had conquered in 1940. Their factories were bombed, their fuel was rationed, their best men were dying faster than they could be replaced. The Luftwaffe was a veteran army fighting a war of youth, and its belief in its own superiority was the last defense against despair. When the intelligence reports from Alaric arrived, flattering that belief, no one had the courage, or perhaps the will, to see through them. The system demanded optimism, and so optimism became truth. In that sense, Alaric did not deceive Germany, Germany deceived itself. Those who fought in the air paid the price. Over the Mediterranean, combat became a daily ritual of attrition. P-38s hunted in pairs, their long range allowing them to escort bombers deeper and deeper into occupied territory. They attacked convoys, strafed airfields, and waited above the clouds for the telltale shimmer of Messerschmitts climbing to intercept. German pilots soon discovered that the twin-boom fighter could turn its weakness into strength. When a P-38 dove, it didn't flutter apart, it vanished. When it climbed, it didn't stall, it ascended beyond reach. The Luftwaffe's tactics, built on outdated intelligence, became predictable. Their formations were ambushed again and again by aircraft they still considered flawed. By the autumn of that year, whispers began circulating among the pilots themselves. Reports contradicted official doctrine. "The lightning is not what they say," one flyer wrote to his commander before being killed 2 weeks later. But these voices never reached Berlin. The structure of command ensured that bad news died before it was heard. Every failure was blamed on the individual, every success attributed to the system. The higher one climbed, the less truth survived. Meanwhile, in Washington and London, Allied intelligence followed a different rhythm. They read German propaganda, intercepted transmissions, and realized that their enemy truly underestimated American aircraft. The Allies understood the power of perception. They encouraged the myth. Carefully planted stories in neutral newspapers described the P-38 as temperamental, plagued with mechanical problems. Some of that misinformation was deliberate, a faint echo of psychological warfare that mirrored Alaric's own distortions. The difference was that the Allies knew it was a lie, and the Germans did not. Within the Abwehr, tension grew. The walls were closing in on Canaris, and every failure of German intelligence became a weapon against him. Himmler's SS accused the Abwehr of incompetence, even treason. Agents vanished. Files were burned. Somewhere within that chaos, Alaric continued to send his reports. Some reached Berlin. Others disappeared into rival offices, altered or rewritten to match what superiors wanted to hear. By now, even Alaric's existence had become uncertain. Some historians would later argue he was not one man but several, the composite identity of a network feeding the same illusion. But the result was the same. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's understanding of Allied aircraft was disastrously out of date. That year, the P-38 escorted bombers all the way to Vienna, to Budapest, to the heart of Germany itself. Its long range made it the perfect guardian for the massive daylight raids that crippled the Reich's fuel supply. For the men on the ground, it was a constant, distant hum in the sky, a reminder that the enemy could reach them whenever he pleased. In Berlin, the fear of failure turned into paranoia. The Abwehr was dissolved. Canaris was arrested. The SS took full control of intelligence operations, and whatever remained of Alaric's reports was lost in the transition. The men who had once praised him now pretended he had never existed. The record of his service was purged, his name erased from indexes. Only fragments survived: references and intercepted messages, marginal notes, fragments of data later found in abandoned offices. To historians, Alaric remains a ghost, the embodiment of a lie so perfect that it consumed even the liar. But the P-38 story did not end with German defeat. In the final years of the war, as the Allies pushed north through Italy and into France, the Lightning became an icon of technological adaptation. It was the first Allied fighter to cross the Alps, the first to provide continuous escort for bombers into Germany, and the first to hunt enemy reconnaissance planes deep over occupied Europe. The very traits the Germans had dismissed, its twin engines, its range, its complexity, were what made it indispensable. It was proof that innovation, when underestimated, becomes a weapon of its own. To the pilots who flew it, the Lightning was more than a machine. They described it as alive. "She felt like she wanted to fight," one American ace recalled. "You didn't fly her, you pointed her at the enemy and she did the rest." In those words lies the contrast between two worlds, one where men trusted the evidence of their eyes and one where they trusted the comfort of their illusions. Back in Germany, the remnants of the Luftwaffe fought with desperation. Fuel shortages forced them to limit flight hours. New pilots, trained in weeks instead of months, were sent into the sky against aircraft their intelligence still claimed were defective. The same phrases appeared in official memoranda again and again. Enemy twin-engine fighters are vulnerable in the climb. Avoid head-on engagements, they will break apart. Each instruction was a death sentence written in bureaucratic language. When historians look back at this period, they often describe it as the collapse of a military machine. But it was more than that, it was the collapse of trust. Every organization built on fear eventually loses the ability to tell itself the truth. By the time the Luftwaffe realized that its information was wrong, it no longer had the strength to act on it. And so, in the ruins of that war, when Allied investigators entered Berlin, they found files, half-burned, half-buried, that told a simple, tragic story. Memos from the Abwehr's western section outlining early P-38 assessments. Correspondence between technical officers praising the reliability of Alaric's sources. And most hauntingly, a report dated January 1943, stamped verified, concluding that the P-38 Lightning is not capable of sustained combat beyond 20,000 feet. On that single line of falsehood, thousands of men had bet their lives. History rarely kills with bullets. More often it kills with paper. In the aftermath, Allied interrogators tried to trace the origin of the misinformation. They questioned captured officers, analysts, pilots. Most shrugged. Some swore they had doubted the reports all along. A few blamed politics, others blamed the chaos of late war intelligence. No one took responsibility. The truth was too diffuse, too diluted by years of repetition to have a single author. In time, as the war faded into memory, the story of the P-38's underestimation became a footnote, overshadowed by grander narratives: the fall of Berlin, the atomic bomb, the New World Order. But within that footnote lies a warning that transcends its era. Information is the most powerful weapon of war, but only if it is believed for the right reasons. When data becomes dogma, when reports become ritual, truth dies quietly, and with it, those who depend on it. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Alaric, not his lies but the system that needed them. The Luftwaffe did not fall because it lacked planes or courage. It fell because it built its faith on a mirror, mistaking its reflection for reality. By 1945, when Germany finally surrendered, the P-38 was no longer new. Newer, faster fighters like the P-51 Mustang had taken its place. But for the men who fought in the skies of Europe, the Lightning had become a symbol of how perception shapes war. For every German pilot who once laughed at its ungainly shape, there was another who died beneath its guns. And for every intelligence officer who once stamped verified on Alaric's reports, there was a realization, too late, that certainty is the deadliest illusion of all. As the last wrecks of the war were cleared from the fields of France and Italy, the P-38s were parked, decommissioned, forgotten. Alaric's name vanished into the archives. But history has a way of preserving irony. The very aircraft the Germans dismissed would later inspire generations of jet fighters. Its twin-boom design, its emphasis on power, range, and versatility, everything that had been mocked, became the blueprint for the future. And so the ghost of the Lightning still flies, not in metal but in lesson. By the time the Allies crossed into France in the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a force. It was a memory flying on borrowed fuel. The skies that once echoed with the confident growl of German engines now belonged to others. The P-38s came first, their silver wings flashing in the morning light, escorting waves of bombers that droned toward the heart of the Reich. Beneath them, the cities burned, and above them, the last of the German fighters rose into hopeless battles. Those who survived the first minutes often returned in silence, too shaken to speak. They had been told that the P-38s were slow, unstable, that their engines overheated at altitude. Yet they had watched them climb past 20,000–30,000 feet, diving with impossible speed, killing with mathematical precision. For many, that was the moment the war changed, not on the ground but in their understanding of truth. In Berlin, men in gray uniforms gathered in rooms filled with smoke and paper, still debating data while their world disintegrated outside. The collapse of the Abwehr had left a void filled by fear. The SS now controlled the flow of information, and under Himmler's rule, truth had become a political commodity. Intelligence officers no longer analyzed, they performed. Reports were written not to reflect reality, but to confirm the narrative demanded by the regime. When a new assessment of the P-38 surfaced, compiled from captured aircraft and interrogation transcripts, it was quietly buried. It contradicted too much. It said, in plain language, that the Lightning was one of the most formidable fighters in existence. That its high-altitude performance, its twin-engine reliability, and its reach had rendered entire German defenses obsolete. The report never reached the Führer's desk. Instead, a sanitized version did, concluding that the enemy's aircraft continued to show weaknesses under sustained combat. Those words, like so many before them, were lies made to soothe. But within the shattered remains of the Abwehr, a few men still tried to make sense of what had gone wrong. Among them was Oberstleutnant Hans Petersen, whose early warnings had been ignored. He now worked under surveillance, his mail intercepted, his movements restricted. Yet he continued to collect evidence: crashed wrecks, pilot diaries, fragments of intercepted Allied communications, all pointing to the same conclusion, that the failure of German intelligence had not been caused by enemies abroad, but by delusion within. In a notebook later recovered from his apartment, he wrote a single line that reads like an epitaph for the entire Reich: "We built an empire on information and destroyed it with belief." While Petersen wrote in the shadows, Alaric vanished. No one knew if he had been arrested, killed, or simply disappeared into the chaos of collapsing networks. Some believed he had fled to Switzerland, others that he had been captured by the Allies and turned. A few whispered that he had never existed at all, that Alaric had been a fiction, an invention of the Abwehr to hide its own failures. The truth is that even the truth was lost. In the wreckage of archives burned to ash and offices bombed to rubble, all that remained were traces, ghostly signatures on yellowed paper. The story might have ended there, buried under the weight of greater tragedies. But years later, when historians sifted through what was left of the Reich's intelligence files, they found something unexpected. Among the fragments of Alaric's correspondence was a single message, transmitted through an encoded channel to Berlin in late 1942. It read, "Enemy fighter under development, designation P-38. Twin-engine high-altitude experimental. Initial tests poor. Performance exaggerated. Unlikely to see mass production." The message was real, verifiable, and dated months before the Lightning entered combat. And attached to it was an annotation, written by a Luftwaffe technical officer: "Excellent work from Alaric. Confirms our assessment. No further investigation required." That single phrase, "no further investigation required," may be the most expensive sentence ever written in the history of German aviation. It encapsulated the decay of a system that no longer sought truth because it believed it already owned it. In that sentence lived the arrogance of empires, the blindness of certainty, the comfort of lies told too long. Meanwhile, the P-38 was evolving. Pilots who once struggled with its controls now mastered its balance. New models improved its climb, its dive, its endurance. American squadrons flying out of Corsica, Sardinia, and southern Italy began to dominate the Mediterranean air war. They destroyed convoys, shot down reconnaissance planes, and eliminated German supply lines. By 1944, the Lightning was not just a fighter, it was the eyes and claws of the Allied advance. And as German cities fell one by one, the sound of its engines became a symbol of inevitability. For the men of the Luftwaffe, it was more than defeat, it was disillusionment. They had lived by numbers, by tables of performance and range, by diagrams that told them who would win before a single bullet was fired. When those numbers proved false, their world collapsed. Some pilots blamed fate. Others blamed the men in Berlin. In post-war interviews, survivors spoke of bitterness more than fear. "They told us the enemy was weak," one said, "and when he was not, we had no faith left in anything." Faith, that was the word they all returned to. Not faith in God, but in a system that had replaced him. The Reich had demanded belief as a weapon, and when belief failed, there was nothing left to hold. The same delusion that had built the myth of the invincible Luftwaffe now devoured it from within. And beneath that, there lingered another irony, one that history often repeats. The Germans had always prided themselves on precision, on engineering, on science. They built rockets that touched the edge of space, submarines that prowled silently through oceans, tanks that terrified entire continents. Yet in the end, they were undone not by lack of technology, but by the corruption of knowledge. Facts were filtered through ideology until they ceased to be facts at all. When Petersen's notebook was discovered after the war, tucked behind a false wall in his apartment, investigators found his final entry dated February 1945. It read, "Intelligence without integrity is suicide." He was executed by the SS 2 months later for suspected defeatism. Outside, the world he had tried to warn was already collapsing. The Red Army was approaching from the east, the Western Allies from the west, and above them the skies swarmed with aircraft, Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and still the old P-38s, their engines echoing through the ruins. For those who remembered, it was like hearing ghosts. The plane that had once been dismissed as useless was now the herald of their destruction. When Berlin finally fell, the surviving records of the Abwehr were seized by the Allies. In them, American intelligence officers found confirmation of what they had long suspected, that misinformation had crippled the Luftwaffe long before fuel shortages and bombings had. The irony was bitter. The Germans had been outsmarted not by spies but by themselves. In post-war interrogations, former officers were asked if they had ever questioned Alaric's reports. One replied, "We question nothing." In those days, questioning was dangerous. Another said simply, "The data fit our hopes, so we accepted it." It was the purest confession of the era, that hope, once weaponized, is indistinguishable from blindness. For the historians who pieced this story together, the tragedy of Alaric is not merely a footnote to the war but a mirror. It reflects a universal truth, that every empire at the height of its power begins to rot the moment it stops doubting itself. The Luftwaffe's fall was only the most visible symptom of a deeper decay, a culture where information became flattery and flattery became death. In the decades that followed, as the world rebuilt itself and new wars began in new skies, the lesson was often forgotten. But it lingers, quiet and constant, in every intelligence agency, in every control room, in every government office that deals with power and truth. The lesson that data means nothing without humility. That knowledge, without skepticism, is only another form of faith. And somewhere, buried in the noise of history, Alaric's name remains. No photograph, no confirmed identity, just fragments of a man, or perhaps an invention, who helped an empire believe in its own invincibility until it was too late. He may have died in the chaos of 1945. He may have lived under another name in another country, watching the new world rise from the ruins he helped create. But in a way he never needed to survive. His work already had. It lived in the smoke above the cities, in the wrecks of planes that never should have been lost, in the silence between truth and what men choose to believe. By the spring of 1945, the war was ending not with a roar but with a long, unraveling sigh. The Reich that once promised 1,000 years now measured its life in days. Its armies were broken, its cities hollowed out by fire, and the skies, the same skies that had once been the canvas of its power, belonged to others. The few remaining Luftwaffe squadrons flew without strategy, without command, often without hope. Their pilots took off knowing they would not return. They called it Fliegen Tod, the Flying Death. The P-38 Lightning still patrolled overhead, older now, their aluminum skins dulled by years of war but still lethal. When they appeared through the clouds, German soldiers below barely looked up anymore. They had learned that resistance was useless against inevitability. The lightning had become the sound of consequence. In those last months, fragments of the old intelligence network still flickered in the ruins. Former Abwehr agents tried to save themselves by selling information to whoever would listen. The SS, the Allies, even black market brokers trading secrets for food. Among those fragments, the name Alaric surfaced again. Allied interrogators in Switzerland received a rumor that a German agent under that code name had been operating out of Lisbon, feeding Berlin reports sourced from British double agents. The British had been masters of deception throughout the war, turning captured spies into instruments of misinformation. It was entirely possible that Alaric had been one of them, a pawn in a game too large for any one man to understand. If that were true, then the lie that crippled the Luftwaffe had not been born of arrogance alone but had been engineered, cultivated, and weaponized. The Allies had given the Germans exactly what they wanted to believe, and the Germans had believed it perfectly. Yet, in the end, whether Alaric was a double agent or simply a mirror of German delusion made no difference. The outcome was the same. The Luftwaffe died not in combat but in confusion. Its fall was not marked by one final battle, but by the quiet disintegration of belief. The last transmissions from German Air Command spoke of operational difficulties, communication failures, reduced efficiency. Each phrase was a euphemism for collapse. The system that had once demanded certainty now drowned in ambiguity. No one trusted the numbers anymore. No one trusted each other. And when truth dies, no army can fight. After the surrender, the Allies collected what remained: files, aircraft, men. They studied the wrecks of the P-38's victims, compared reports, traced the paper trail of intelligence failures. In debriefing rooms lit by harsh fluorescent lights, captured officers tried to explain how they could have been so wrong for so long. Some blamed chaos, others blamed Hitler's interference, others blamed the fear that kept them from speaking. But underneath every excuse lay the same rot: pride. It was easier to die believing the enemy was inferior than to live knowing he was not. Decades later, when historians reconstructed these events, they found in them a perfect parable of modern war. Not a story of bombs and bullets, but of data, belief, and the psychology of command. The P-38 Lightning became more than a machine. It became a metaphor. A symbol of how knowledge, once filtered through ideology, ceases to be knowledge at all. The Luftwaffe's failure was not mechanical or tactical. It was epistemological. They lost because they no longer knew how to know. There is something haunting in that. When a civilization becomes too certain of its own brilliance, it stops testing its assumptions. It begins to mistake confidence for truth. Every empire in history has fallen to that same disease: the Romans, the British, the Soviets. Each believed their system self-correcting, their methods infallible. And each, in their time, met a moment when the world changed faster than they could admit. For Germany, that moment arrived with the P-38. The Lightning's twin booms, glinting under the European sun, were the shape of the future Germany had refused to see. Its design was unconventional, its methods unorthodox, but its success proved that innovation thrives where doubt is allowed to breathe. The Americans built an aircraft that challenged their own engineers, that forced them to confront problems openly, that evolved through iteration and failure. The Germans built a system that punished failure and rewarded certainty. One grew stronger, the other ossified and broke. In that contrast lies the moral center of this story. The spy, the lie, the machine, these are details. The truth lies deeper, in the relationship between power and humility. The Germans believed their intelligence absolute. The Americans questioned theirs until it worked. The difference between the two was not technology, it was philosophy. When the war was over, the survivors of the Luftwaffe returned to a homeland unrecognizable. Their cities were gone, their families scattered, their uniforms meaningless. Some became engineers for the Allies. Others vanished into obscurity. A few wrote memoirs trying to make sense of what had happened. In those pages, one theme appears again and again: the sense of betrayal. "We were not defeated by the enemy," one former colonel wrote, "we were betrayed by the lies we told ourselves." And so the myth of the P-38 Lightning lingered, half mechanical, half moral. It became a story whispered among those who study intelligence and warfare, a cautionary tale about the seductive power of certainty. In the corridors of modern agencies, the lesson is still repeated: never believe what you most want to be true, because that is the lie that kills. In time, the Lightning was retired. Its engines fell silent, its wings corroded in hangars and museums. Children climbed into its cockpit, pressing buttons that no longer worked. To them, it was just a relic, a beautiful machine from a distant war. They could not hear the echo that older men still could, the echo of arrogance, of overconfidence, of quiet human error. Yet somewhere in that silence, history still speaks. It tells us that wars are not lost in the air or on the ground, but in the mind. That every bullet fired begins first as a thought, every defeat first as an assumption. The P-38 Lightning never set out to be a legend. It was simply a machine built by men who refused to stop asking questions. And that, in the end, made all the difference. As for Alaric, if he was ever real, his legacy endures in the margins of forgotten documents and in the moral of this story. He was the man who told the truth the world wanted, and for that, millions suffered. Perhaps he died nameless, perhaps he lived quietly, but his ghost remains wherever truth is traded for comfort. His story is not unique. Every age has its Alarics, men and systems that turn certainty into strategy, that mistake confidence for knowledge. And every age pays the same price. So when we look back at those grainy black and white films of World War II, the contrails twisting in the sky, the silent footage of pilots climbing into their cockpits, we should remember that what killed them was not only lead and fire but belief. Belief that the enemy was weak. Belief that the data was perfect. Belief that they could not be wrong. History does not forgive arrogance, it waits for it. The sound of engines fades. The skies clear. The war ends. But somewhere in the long echo of memory, the lightning still hums, a faint vibration reminding us that truth is fragile, that power is blind, and that the line between knowledge and faith is thinner than the wing of a plane cutting through cloud. And as the last light of day falls across the rusted skeleton of a P-38 in some forgotten field, one can almost imagine a voice carried by the wind, low and steady, whispering the final lesson. The greatest enemy of intelligence is certainty. Silence follows. And history begins again.